Now, it's time to bring you perspective on the programme. And my guest today is a man who certainly lives his life on the edge. And by on the edge, I mean both physically and emotionally. He's a mountaineer. He's climbed Everest without oxygen. He's also a photographer, often combining both passions. But behind that lies a difficult childhood where he suffered from acute mood swings and depression, diagnosed, in fact, as bipolar. His new book in English is called The Colour of Everything, A Journey to Quiet the Chaos Within. It's just been translated now into French, as you can see there, Les Brûlures de glace, or ice burns. And Cory Richards joins us here on set. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Before we talk to you, let's just have a bit of an idea of some of your work.
I've generally spent the better part of my life exploring the boundaries. My career now is going out and exploring spaces that are ill-defined. Climbing is very much the same thing. It's less about getting to the top and less about the preparation, but it's everything that exists in the space, both emotionally and physically, between those 2 points, And so it's exploring that line of life and death and wellness and sickness. That's where I've tried to spend most of my time because that's where I find the most interest.
Wow, some pretty dramatic images there.
Yeah.
We're going to look at some of your photographs while we keep talking. I mean, let's start right at the beginning. Let's talk about your childhood, because it was a very happy childhood, wasn't it, growing up in the Rocky Mountains?
It was. It was actually, it's so funny that the story kind of evolved the way it did, because if you look at early childhood and early childhood development, I had a great childhood. Climbing, skiing. I started skiing when I was 2 and climbing when I was 5. And my parents they took us outside and believed that was, education and development were equal parts academic and experience. So it really was sort of an Eden at some point, and then it went sideways.
Yeah, what happened? Was there like a moment when life changed, or was it gradual?
It was very gradual, and this is, I think, one of the things that gets misunderstood about mental health is it's not an individual issue. It's deeply woven into family dynamics, and families, as we know, are complicated. Those relationships are deeply complicated, and as I got into my adolescence, there was more and more conflict between my brother and I, which became deeply violent. And then, by virtue of that, I ended up institutionalized. I was in inpatient treatment for 8 months, and then on the street, and it was during that time that I was diagnosed with bipolar 2. And so that sort of set off this journey with mental health. But unwinding that is actually really complicated. But one of the things that I've come to is blame is sort of useless in this. It doesn't matter. In fact, blame keeps you stuck in a mindset of victimhood.
Describe them. Is it possible to describe them? What goes on in your mind, or is it completely undescribable?
Well, it's both ineffable, and the best way I've figured out how to articulate it is noise. And so when we think about rapid thoughts, it's almost overlapping thought to the place that it becomes impossible to make sense of it. And with that can come certain ideas of grandiosity. And oftentimes with bipolar, specifically with the way I've experienced it, you have overlapping sensations of deep depression, even suicidal depression, and this sort of heightened sense of being. So a hypomanic state overlapped with a depressive state, and they call that a mixed episode. But it's very loud when it speeds up, and that becomes chaotic, and my nervous system dysregulates to the point where it's almost paralytic.
So how did you come out of that low point?
And there have been several throughout life, but, I'm 44 now, and really it's been about gathering tools to manage this. Because on the other side of that is these elevated moods can also offer a perspective on the world that is unique and managed well. I believe mental health complications or journeys can actually be sort of transmuted into superpowers. And so there's a lot of tools that I use, everything from medication, and I'm very open about the psychedelic therapy that I've used, which was transformational. And meditation, movement, eating well, I don't try to self-optimize, which is so popular in the wellness space these days, because I think that adds stress. And then when you don't hit those marks, you have shame around it, which is sort of one of the base levels of what perpetuates mental health issues.
And on a day-to-day basis, how does the mountaineering and the photography fit into all of that?
Well, the mountaineering and being a professional athlete and photographing for National Geographic, they were basically my life for 2 decades. And recently I took a step back from it because I realized that I was living in such a hyper-stimulated state that I was constantly in my sympathetic nervous system, and that was unsustainable. So I took a step back and I started to unwind it, and that's really where the book came from.
I mean, the pictures we're seeing are amazing, and it's not just mountaineering, is it? I mean, and the photography that you do is other photographs as well. That's led you into other things.
Yeah, I mean, I actually was always more passionate about human stories. And so the climbing and going all over the world really allowed me to have access to these places that I otherwise wouldn't have access to. And so I've always been, I think by virtue of my own experience, more curious about the human experience and humanity in general, because I think that we are so much more similar than we choose to believe. We love to other each other, and we love to put each other in these boxes that keep us safe in our own, when in fact that's just not the case. We're so similar.
Looking at some of these images, it was incredible the number of places that you've been and the way you've managed to capture them as well. I mean, it's a very, outstanding, really. Do you, presumably during all this, you're still having difficulty? Yeah,
of course. I mean, one of the things that happens in early childhood development is we sort of build our software, right? And that inevitably becomes sort of deeply ingrained by neural pathways in our minds. And when we have chaotic childhoods, when we have violent childhoods, where we can't anticipate, we lose what's called future forecasting, because we're constantly trying to adapt to the immediacy of the situation. And so it's pretty interesting that those skills that we use often become tools later in life, but we gravitate towards high stimulus environments, right? So that's how I ended up there. And then on a day-to-day basis, now it's sort of like, okay, how do I engage with those tools, the strengths of them, without getting overwhelmed by them,
And tell us about the book. What's the aim of it?
The aim of the book, really, it started as a way to try to understand myself, but The Color of Everything became, in every way, an act of service, because I believe that the power of telling stories, specifically our personal narratives, is really an invitation for others to feel less alone in theirs. And so my hope is, while you might not be able to relate to climbing Everest, really it's not about that. It's not about adventure. It just uses adventure as a through line to talk about what happens in our minds, what happens in our hearts. And again, those experiences are ubiquitous. Heartbreak is something we all know. Sadness is something we all know. Joy is something we all know. So it's just a vehicle to talk about that. And it's also meant to be deeply honest, because I think we so often hide the darkest pieces of ourselves because we think they're unlovable, but they're not.
That's exactly what my last question was going to be. I mean, listening to you, you obviously enjoy, maybe is the right word, in telling your story. And presumably that comes across very much in the book.
Well, it's funny. In many ways, I'm sick of myself, right? Like, I do get sort of, but I get like, there is some fatigue because I don't love talking about myself. What I love is the power of storytelling to invite others into connection. And so if my story can act as that, and I say that as humbly as possible, but if it can be the catalyst for connection, then I'm willing to continue to tell that story so long as it's generative and its impact is net positive.
Wow. Well, I'm looking forward to delving into the book in more depth. I've had a little bit of a glance, but not time to read all of it, but I certainly will now. Cory Richards, thanks very much for coming in and
talking to us
on the program.
Such a pleasure.
Book in English is called The Colour of Everything, A Journey to Quiet the Chaos Within. Just been translated into French, as you saw, Les brûlures de glace, or ice burns, if you like, a very literal translation there. Thanks very much once again, Cory Richards.